When was Hollywood's golden age?
Hollywood had its heyday in the 1930s, in the same decade that the Great Depression crippled the world economy. The American film industry enjoyed its golden age. The era was marked by technical innovations. Talking movies had made their debut in 1927 with the first full-length film with sound, The Jazz Singer, and by 1932 all films were talkies. The first Technicolor film, Becky Sharp, debuted in 1935, and by 1939 was perfected when Gone with the Wind was released. And special effects were brought to the screen in 1933 with King Kong, which was the result of painstaking stop-motion and rear projection photography. In the meantime, movie stars such as Clark Gable, Claudette Colbert, Greta Garbo, and the Marx Brothers achieved public followings that were the envy of political and business leaders. The MGM, Warner Brothers, and RKO Studios led Hollywood production, but other studios, including Fox, Paramount, Universal, Columbia, and United Artists, also fared well during these difficult times. In 1939 Hollywood had what has often been called its greatest year. Among the top releases that year were the classics Gone with the Wind, The Wizard of Oz, Stagecoach, Ninotchka, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and Gunga Din. By the end of the decade Hollywood had become a major contributor to popular culture, an occasional contributor to high culture, and a dynamic, if unsteady, force in the nation's economy.
When was Hollywood's golden age?
Hollywood had its heyday in the 1930s, in the same decade that the Great Depression crippled the world economy. The American film industry enjoyed its golden age. The era was marked by technical innovations. Talking movies had made their debut in 1927 with the first full-length film with sound, The Jazz Singer, and by 1932 all films were talkies. The first Technicolor film, Becky Sharp, debuted in 1935, and by 1939 was perfected when Gone with the Wind was released. And special effects were brought to the screen in 1933 with King Kong, which was the result of painstaking stop-motion and rear projection photography. In the meantime, movie stars such as Clark Gable, Claudette Colbert, Greta Garbo, and the Marx Brothers achieved public followings that were the envy of political and business leaders. The MGM, Warner Brothers, and RKO Studios led Hollywood production, but other studios, including Fox, Paramount, Universal, Columbia, and United Artists, also fared well during these difficult times. In 1939 Hollywood had what has often been called its greatest year. Among the top releases that year were the classics Gone with the Wind, The Wizard of Oz, Stagecoach, Ninotchka, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and Gunga Din. By the end of the decade Hollywood had become a major contributor to popular culture, an occasional contributor to high culture, and a dynamic, if unsteady, force in the nation's economy.
What were newsreels?
Newsreels got their start in 1910 when the pioneer film newsreel Path Gazette was shown in Britain and the United States. French cinematographer Charles Path, 1863 to 1957, and his brother Émile, 1860 to 1937, were Paris agents for the Edison phonograph. They visited London to acquire film-making equipment and secured financial support in order to set up production units in Britain, the United States, Italy, Germany, Russia, and Japan. These short movies, covering current events, were predominantly used during wartime and were shown in theaters before motion pictures were shown. Superseded by television newscasts, the last newsreels were screened in 1967.
What were newsreels?
Newsreels got their start in 1910 when the pioneer film newsreel Path Gazette was shown in Britain and the United States. French cinematographer Charles Path, 1863 to 1957, and his brother Émile, 1860 to 1937, were Paris agents for the Edison phonograph. They visited London to acquire film-making equipment and secured financial support in order to set up production units in Britain, the United States, Italy, Germany, Russia, and Japan. These short movies, covering current events, were predominantly used during wartime and were shown in theaters before motion pictures were shown. Superseded by television newscasts, the last newsreels were screened in 1967.
What were newsreels?
Newsreels got their start in 1910 when the pioneer film newsreel Path Gazette was shown in Britain and the United States. French cinematographer Charles Path, 1863 to 1957, and his brother Émile, 1860 to 1937, were Paris agents for the Edison phonograph. They visited London to acquire film-making equipment and secured financial support in order to set up production units in Britain, the United States, Italy, Germany, Russia, and Japan. These short movies, covering current events, were predominantly used during wartime and were shown in theaters before motion pictures were shown. Superseded by television newscasts, the last newsreels were screened in 1967.
What are the elements of Japanese kabuki?
The most popular traditional form of Japanese drama, kabuki, features dance, song, mime, colorful costumes, Heavy makeup, and lively, exaggerated movements to tell stories about historical events. The drama had its beginnings in 1575 when Okuni, a woman, founded a kabuki company. In 1603 at Kyoto, women danced at the Kitani shrine, playing men's roles as well as women's. In October 1629 kabuki became an all-male affair by order of the shogun Iemitsu, who decided that it was immoral for women to dance in public. Just as in Elizabethan England, women's roles were then performed by men. The performing art became increasingly popular during the 1600s, eclipsing bunraku. Puppet theater, in which a narrator recites a story, which is acted by large, lifelike puppets. Today kabuki remains a viable art form, borrowing from other forms of drama to adapt to changing times.
Was Beethoven really deaf for much of his life?
Yes, Ludwig van Beethoven, 1770 to 1827, suffered a gradual hearing loss during his 20s, and eventually lost his hearing altogether, in his early 30s. The loss was devastating to the German composer. In a letter to his brother he wrote, "But how humbled I feel when someone near me hears the distant sound of a flute. And I hear nothing, when someone hears a shepherd singing, and I hear nothing." At one point he even contemplated suicide but instead continued his work. He had studied briefly with Mozart, in 1787, and Joseph Haydn, in 1792. And appeared for the first time in his own concert in 1800. While the loss of his hearing later prevented him from playing the piano properly, it did nothing to hold back his creativity. Between 1800 and 1824, Beethoven wrote 9 symphonies. And many believe that he developed the form to perfection. His other works include 5 piano concertos and 32 piano sonatas, as well as string quartets. Sonatas for piano and violin, opera, and vocal music, including oratorios. It was about the time that he completed his work on his 3rd symphony. The Eroica, 1804, that he went completely deaf. Though he was himself a classicist, music critics often refer to a turning point marked by the Eroica, which shows the complexity of the Romantic age of music. A true genius, Beethoven's innovations include expanding the length of both the symphony and the piano concerto, increasing the number of movements in the string quartet, from 4 to 7, and adding instruments including the trombone, contrabassoon, and the piccolo to the orchestra, giving it a broader range. Through his adventurous piano compositions, Beethoven also heightened the status of the instrument, which was a relatively new invention, 1710. Among his most well-known and most often performed works are his 3rd, Eroica, 5th, 6th, Pastoral, and 9th, Choral, symphonies, as well as the 4th and 5th piano concertos. It is remarkable, even unfathomable, that these works, so familiar to so many, were never heard by their composer. A poignant anecdote tells of Beethoven sitting on stage to give tempo cues to the conductor during the first public performance of his Ninth Symphony. When the performance had ended, Beethoven, his back to the audience, was unaware of the standing ovation his work had received until a member of the choir turned Beethoven's chair around so he could see the tremendous response.
What did Shakespeare study?
It is thought that William Shakespeare, 1564–1616, attended the King's New School, the local grammar school in Stratford-upon-Avon, England, where the main course of instruction was in Latin. There, students were taught rhetoric, logic, and ethics, and studied works by classical authors Terence, Plautus, Cicero, Virgil, Plutarch, Horace, and Ovid. It is believed that this was the extent of Shakespeare's education. There is no evidence that he attended a university.
When was Hollywood's golden age?
Hollywood had its heyday in the 1930s, in the same decade that the Great Depression crippled the world economy. The American film industry enjoyed its golden age. The era was marked by technical innovations. Talking movies had made their debut in 1927 with the first full-length film with sound, The Jazz Singer, and by 1932 all films were talkies. The first Technicolor film, Becky Sharp, debuted in 1935, and by 1939 was perfected when Gone with the Wind was released. And special effects were brought to the screen in 1933 with King Kong, which was the result of painstaking stop-motion and rear projection photography. In the meantime, movie stars such as Clark Gable, Claudette Colbert, Greta Garbo, and the Marx Brothers achieved public followings that were the envy of political and business leaders. The MGM, Warner Brothers, and RKO Studios led Hollywood production, but other studios, including Fox, Paramount, Universal, Columbia, and United Artists, also fared well during these difficult times. In 1939 Hollywood had what has often been called its greatest year. Among the top releases that year were the classics Gone with the Wind, The Wizard of Oz, Stagecoach, Ninotchka, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and Gunga Din. By the end of the decade Hollywood had become a major contributor to popular culture, an occasional contributor to high culture, and a dynamic, if unsteady, force in the nation's economy.
How old is comedy?
Like tragedy, comedy as a form of drama dates back to ancient Greece. While tragedy was meant to engage human emotions, thereby cleansing spectators of their fears. According to Aristotle, comedy's intent was simply to entertain and amuse audiences. Athenian poet Aristophanes, who flourished circa the 5th century BC, is considered the greatest ancient writer of comedy. His plays, written for the festival of Dionysus, the god of fertility, wine, and, later, drama, were a mix of social, political, and literary satire. Performance vehicles included farce, parody, and fantasy. During the 4th century BC, this old comedy evolved into a new comedy, which was less biting and more romantic and realistic in nature. New comedy, which was marked by strong character development and often subtle humor, includes the works of Greek playwright Menander, flourished during the 4th century BC, and those of Roman comic writers Plautus, flourished 3rd century BC, and Terence, flourished 2nd century BC, all of whom were influences on Ben Jonson. William Shakespeare, Jean Molière, and other writers of the 16th and 17th centuries.
When was our system for notating music developed?
The innovation came in the early 11th century, when Guido of Arezzo, c. 991-1050, an Italian monk, devised a precise system for defining pitch. Guido was a leading music teacher and theorist in his day. As such, he was invited in about 1028 to Rome, where he presented a collection of religious anthems to Pope John XIX. Guido used a system of 4 horizontal lines, a staff, on which to chart pitch, and he used the syllables ut, later replaced with do, re, mi, fa, sol, and la to name the first 6 tones of the major scale. Before Guido developed his precise method for teaching music, singers had to learn melodies by memorizing them, a process that took many years. Using his notating system, singers were able to sight-read melodies. Guido's famous treatise, Micrologus, was one of the most widely used instruction books of the Middle Ages, 500-1350.
How many musical Bachs were there?
Johann Sebastian Bach, 1685-1750. Was only one of a long and extended line of competent musicians, some 14 of them. The Bach family was a musical dynasty. JS's father, Ambrosius Bach, 1645-1695. Was a court musician for the Duke of Eisenach, and several of J.S. Bach's close relatives were organists in churches. His eldest brother, Johann Christoph Bach, 1671-1721, was apprenticed to the famous German composer Johann Pachelbel. 1653-1706, J.S. Bach left a musical legacy even beyond the vast body of church, vocal, and instrumental music that he composed. 4 of his sons and 1 grandson were also accomplished musicians. The English Bach refers to J.S.'s son Johann Christian Bach, 1735-1782. who composed operas, oratorios, arias, cantatas, symphonies, concertos, and chamber music. A proponent of Rococo-style music, J.C. Bach influenced Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, 1756 to 1791.
How long has the waltz been danced?
Considered the quintessential ballroom dance, the waltz first became popular in Europe in 1813. But it dates as far back as the mid-1700s. The first written occurrence of the word waltz was in 1781. In the 1850s the dance captivated Vienna, and the prolific Johann Strauss, 1825 to 1899. Also known as the Waltz King, produced scores of new waltzes to meet the increasing demand. Many of the compositions were named for professional associations and societies. One of the most well-known waltzes is the Blue Danube. First performed by Strauss on February 15, 1867, in Vienna. The lyrics, from a poem by Carl Beck, were sung by the Viennese Male Singing Society. The new waltz created an immediate sensation. It is an Austrian tradition whenever the Blue Danube is played that the opening strain is played first, followed by a pause before the work is played by the full orchestra. The pause is so that the audience may applaud.
What was Goethe's contribution to world literature?
Johann Wolfgang Goethe, 1749 to 1832, is considered Germany's greatest writer. He also was a scientist, artist, musician, and philosopher. As a writer, Goethe experimented with many genres and literary styles, and his works became a shaping force of the major German literary movements of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. His masterwork, the poetic drama Faust, 1808, rewritten 1832, embodies the author's humanistic ideal of a world literature, one that transcends the boundaries of nations and historical periods. Indeed, the story of Faust, a German astrologer, magician, and soothsayer, c. 1480 to 1540, remains one of universal interest, and has been treated often in both literature and music. The legendary figure was believed to have sold his soul to the devil in exchange for the opportunity to experience all of life's pleasures.
When was the first movie shown?
On March 22, 1895, the first in-theater showing of a motion picture took place in Paris. When the members of the Société d'Encouragement à l'Industrie Nationale, National Society for the Promotion of Industry, gathered to see a film of workers leaving the Lumière factory at Lyons for their dinner hour. The cinematography of inventors Louis, 1864 to 1948, and Augusta, 1862 to 1954, Lumière, ages 31 and 33 respectively, was a vast improvement over the kinetoscope. Introduced in 1894 by Thomas Edison, whose film could only be viewed by one person at a time. The 16 frame per second mechanism developed by the Lumiere brothers became the standard for films for decades. The following year, on April 20, 1896, the first motion picture showing in the United States took place in New York. The film was shown using Thomas Edison's vitascope, which was an improvement on his kinetoscope, and a projector made by Thomas Armat.
Was Shakespeare famous in his own time?
Yes, by 1592 he was well known as a dramatist. William Shakespeare. 1564–1616, was the son of John Shakespeare, who belonged to the merchant class, and Mary Arden, who came from a family of slightly higher social standing. His first plays, the three parts of the Henry VI history cycle, were presented in London in 1590–1592. The first reference to Shakespeare in the London literary world dates from 1592, when dramatist Robert Greene, c. 1558–92, referred to him as an upstart crow. The critical remark notwithstanding, Shakespeare's literary reputation and his acclaim grew over the next few years. He experimented with classical dramatic forms in the early tragedy Titus Andronicus, 1593–1594, and issued a pair of narrative poems, Venus and Adonis, 1593, and The Rape of Lucerus, 1594. These works, which played to the fashion for poems on mythological themes, were immensely successful, establishing honey-tongued Shakespeare as his contemporary Francis Mears. 1565–1647, called him as a prominent writer. Shakespeare further established himself as a professional actor and playwright when he joined the Lord Chamberlain's Men, an acting company formed in 1594 when they began performing at theatres in London. In 1603 the group was renamed the King's Men. They became the foremost London company, largely attributable to the fact that after joining the group in 1594, Shakespeare wrote for no other company.
Why was Voltaire exiled from France?
The French writer Voltaire, 1694–1778, born François-Marie Arouet, Voltaire was an assumed name, was imprisoned twice during his lifetime. He was released the second time on the condition that he leave the country. The prison terms and expulsion were the result of Voltaire's expert satire, which first got him into trouble when he was a young man. After finishing a course of study at the Jesuit school College Louis Le Grand, 1704–11, Voltaire joined a group of aristocrats in Paris who valued the young writer's wit. He wrote and circulated verse criticizing the regent, the Duc d'Orléans. As a result of these offensive works, Voltaire was put into the Bastille, in 1717, where he began writing an epic, the Henriade, about France's King Henry IV, 1553 to 1610. Full of indictments of religious fanaticism and praise for toleration. The work proved highly controversial in its day. Such anti-establishment protests eventually led the writer to have an argument with the Chevalier de Rohan, a member of one of France's most powerful families. This conflict resulted in Voltaire's arrest, imprisonment, again in the Bastille, and exile to England in 1726. He stayed in London until 1729. Returning to France, the writer penned his observations on English social and political beliefs. Letters Concerning the English Nation, 1734. Again stirring a controversy, his exaltation of English liberalism was viewed by the authorities as a criticism of French conservatism. He fled the trouble by going into seclusion in Lorraine, where he stayed through 1749. The biting criticism of his works won the writer fame as well as controversy, both of which followed him throughout his life. In 1750 he was invited to visit Prussian King Frederick the Great at court, accepting. He stayed there only 2 years. He was forced to leave in 1753 after quarreling with the man he called the Philosopher King. He spent the last 20 years of his life in Switzerland. Returning to Paris to see a performance of one of his plays, Irene, just before his death.
How did modern dance begin?
American dancer and choreographer Martha Graham, 1894 to 1991, is the acknowledged creator of modern dance. She was 35 years old when the Martha Graham Dance Group made its debut on April 14, 1929. Ushering in a new era in dance performance. The new form of dance dissolved the separation between mind and body and relied on technique that was built from within. Graham's interest in dance had begun in her youth. And as an astute observer and manipulator of light and space, she came to be regarded later in life as one of the masters of the modernist movement on a par with artist Pablo Picasso, 1881 to 1973. She is credited with revolutionizing dance as an art form. In her hands it had become nonlinear and non-representational theater. Choreographing some 180 works in her lifetime, she also taught many students who rose to prominence as accomplished and masterful dancers, including Merce Cunningham and Paul Taylor.
Mitchell later said that as he sat thinking about the tragic news, he wondered to himself, "Here I am running around the world doing all these things, why not do them at home?"
Mitchell had spent his youth in Harlem, and he felt he should return there to establish a school to pass on his knowledge to others and to give black dancers the opportunity to perform. The primary purpose of the school was to promote interest in and teach young black people the art of classical ballet, modern and ethnic dance, thereby creating a much-needed self-awareness and better self-image of the students themselves. The idea was a success. During the 1970s and 1980s the company toured nationally and internationally, often performing to sell-out crowds and participating in prestigious events including international art festivals, a state dinner at the White House, and the closing ceremonies of the 1984 Olympic Games. Today, the Dance Theater of Harlem is acknowledged as one of the world's finest ballet companies. Not only did Mitchell succeed in giving black dancers the opportunity to learn and to perform, he effectively erased color barriers in the world of dance, testimony to the universality of classical ballet.
What was the Hollywood blacklist?
In 1947 studio executives assembled at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York put together a list of alleged communist sympathizers, naming some 300 writers, directors, actors, and others known or suspected to have Communist Party affiliations or of having invoked the Fifth Amendment against self-incrimination when questioned by the House Committee to investigate un-American activities. The Hollywood 10 who refused to tell the committee whether or not they had been communists were Alva Bessie, Herbert Biberman, Lester Cole, Edward Dmytryk, Ring Lardner Jr., John Howard Lawson, Albert Maltz, Samuel Ornitz, Adrian Scott, and Dalton Trumbo. The film industry blacklisted the Hollywood 10 on November 25. And all of them drew short prison sentences for refusing to testify.
Which came first, the word Scrooge or Dickens's character Scrooge?
The character Ebenezer Scrooge came first. Brought to life in Charles Dickens's extremely popular story A Christmas Carol, published in 1843. By 1899 the term Scrooge, meaning a miserly person, had entered into usage. Dickens, 1812 to 1870, created many memorable characters. Oliver Twist, Tiny Tim, and Little Nell, to name a few. Among the English writer's most notable works are Oliver Twist, 1837-39, The Old Curiosity Shop, 1840-41, Bleak House, 1852-53, A Tale of Two Cities, 1859, and Great Expectations, 1860-61. Dickens was popular during his own time and is still popular today, attributable not only to the vivid characters he created, but for his expression of social concerns. Though he grew more pessimistic in his later works, Dickens continued to demonstrate his profound sympathy for the oppressed and his belief in the dignity of man.
Is there an American poet laureate?
Yes, in 1985 the U.S. Congress authorized the naming of a national poet laureate. In 1986 Kentucky-born man of letters Robert Penn Warren. 1909 to 1989, became the country's first poet laureate. Among his works are the novels All the King's Men, 1946, Pulitzer Prize, and A Place to Come To. 1977, several volumes of poetry, and essays published in the anthology I'll Take My Stand, 1930. He was also the editor, 1935-42, of the literary journal The Southern Review. Warren's successors have included Joseph Brodsky, Mona Van Dyne, the first woman to receive the honor, and Rita Dove, the first African American to receive the honor. The complete list of poet laureates is available on the Library of Congress's website. http://www.loc.gov/poetry/laureate.html
What was vaudeville?
Light, comical theatrical entertainment. Vaudeville flourished at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. Programs combined a variety of music, theater, and comedy to appeal to a wide audience. Script writers attracted immigrant audiences by using ethnic humor, exaggerating dialects, and joking about the difficulties of daily immigrant life in America. The word vaudeville is derived from an Old French term for a satirical song. Vaudeville, which is a reference to the Var Valley of France, where the songs originated. Vaudeville made its way to the American stage by the 1870s. When acts performed in theaters in New York, Chicago, and other cities. Troupes traveled a circuit of nearly 1,000 theaters around the country. As many as 2 million Americans a day flocked to the shows to see headliners such as comedians Eddie Cantor. 1892 to 1964, and W. C. Fields, 1880 to 1946. Singer Eva Tanguay, 1878 to 1947, and French actress Sarah Bernhardt, 1844 to 1923. During the first 2 decades of the 20th century, vaudeville was the most popular form of entertainment in the country. In the 1930s, just as New York opened the doors of its famous Radio City Music Hall, which was intended to be a theater for vaudeville, the entertainment form began a quick decline. Motion pictures, radio, and, later, television took its place, with numerous vaudeville performers parlaying their success into these new media. Among those entertainers who had their origins in vaudeville acts were actors Rudolph Valentino, Cary Grant, Mae West, Jack Benny, George Burns, Gracie Allen, Ginger Rogers, Fred Astaire, Will Rogers, and Al Jolson.
What were Voltaire's beliefs?
The prolific French writer's corpus of 52 works were produced as part of his lifelong effort to expose injustices. Voltaire's famous words, "Écrasez l'infâme," squash that which is evil, encapsulate his tenets. He believed in God, but abhorred priestly, high church, traditions. He spread the doctrines of rational skepticism to the world. He strongly advocated religious and political tolerance. And he held great faith in humankind's ability to strive for perfection. To the European literary world, he embodied the highest ideal of the Age of Reason, also called the Enlightenment. But victims of his wit feared and denigrated him. Celebrated by some during his lifetime, he has certainly been celebrated since. His masterpiece, Candide, 1759, a satirical tale exploring the nature of good and evil, has been translated into more than 100 languages.
What are the milestones in the motion picture industry?
Motion pictures continue to develop as new, sophisticated technologies are introduced to improve the moviegoing experience for audiences. In the decades following their rudimentary beginnings, there were many early milestones, including not only advancements in technology but improvements in conditions for those working in the then fledgling industry. 1903, Edwin S. Porter's The Great Train Robbery was the first motion picture to tell a complete story. Produced by Edison Studios, the 12-minute epic established a pattern of suspense drama that was followed by subsequent movie makers. 1907. Bell and Howell Co. was founded by Chicago movie projectionist Donald H. Bell and camera repairman Albert S. Howell with $5,000 in capital. The firm went on to improve motion picture photography and projection equipment. 1910, Brooklyn Eagle newspaper cartoonist John Randolph Bray pioneered animated motion picture cartoons. Using a cell system he invented and which was subsequently used by all animators. 1912, Queen Elizabeth, starring Sarah Bernhardt, was shown July 12 at New York's Lyceum Theater and was the first feature-length motion picture seen in America. 1915, D.W. Griffiths. The Birth of a Nation provided the blueprint for narrative films. 1925. The new editing technique used in Potemkin revolutionized the making of motion pictures around the world. Soviet film director Sergei Eisenstein created his masterpiece by splicing film shot at many locations. An approach subsequently adopted by most film directors. 1926, the first motion picture with sound, talkie, was demonstrated. 1927, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences was founded by Louis B. Meyer of MGM Studios. The first president of the Academy was Douglas Fairbanks. 1927, the first full-length talking picture, The Jazz Singer, starring vaudevillian Al Jolson, was released. By 1932 all movies talked. 1929, the first Academy Awards. For 1928 films, were held, winners were William Wellman for Wings, Emiliana Inks for Best Actor, in Last Command, and Janet Gaynor for Best Actress, in Sunrise. Movie columnist Sidney Skalski dubbed the awards the Oscars. 1928, Hollywood's major film studios signed an agreement with the American Telephone and Telegraph Corporation, AT&T, to use their technology to produce films with sound, leading to an explosion in the popularity of motion pictures. 1929, Eastman Kodak introduced 16mm film for motion picture cameras. 1933, the Screen Actors Guild, SAG, was formed when 6 actors met in Hollywood to establish a self-governing organization of actors. The first organizing meeting yielded 18 founding members. 1935, the first full-length Technicolor movie was released, Becky Sharp. The technology, however, was still in development, and the colors appeared garish. 1939, Gone with the Wind was released in Technicolor, which had come a long way since its 1935 debut.
Who founded the Dance Theatre of Harlem?
The Dance Theatre of Harlem, the first world-renowned African-American ballet company, was founded by Arthur Mitchell, 1934, a principal dancer with the New York City Ballet. Along with Carol Schuck, 1920 to 1985, a dance teacher and former director of the Netherlands Ballet. The impetus for the creation of the company came on April 4, 1968, while Mitchell was waiting to board a plane from New York City to Brazil, where he was establishing that country's first national ballet company. And he heard that Martin Luther King Jr., 1929 to 1968, had been assassinated.
What is a poet laureate?
A poet laureate is someone who is recognized by his or her country or state as its most eminent and representative poet. Officially, a poet laureate is appointed or named by the government. England's first, if unofficially titled, poet laureate was Ben Jonson, 1572 to 1637, a contemporary of Shakespeare. Shakespeare acted a leading role in the first of Jonson's great plays. Every Man in His Humour, 1598. In 1605 Jonson began writing a series of masques, short allegorical dramas that were performed by actors wearing masks, for the court. Years later, in 1616, he was appointed poet laureate and in that capacity received a substantial pension. Among Jonson's works are Volpone, 1605, works, a collection of poetry published in 1616, and which includes the oft-quoted line, "Drink to me only with thine eyes, and pleasure reconciled to virtue," 1618. Some sources trace the first British poet laureate back to Edmund Spenser. 1552 or 1553 to 1599, who is called the poet's poet. However, the title of poet laureate was not officially conferred on an English writer until 1638, when poet and dramatist William Davenant, 1606 to 1668, who was reputed to be the godson or even the illegitimate son of Shakespeare, was given the honor. Other poet laureates of England include John Dryden, 1631 to 1700, William Wordsworth, 1770 to 1850, and Lord Alfred Tennyson, 1809 to 1892.
Why do music historians talk about before Bach and after Bach?
Some scholars use these terms to classify music history since the life work of Johann Sebastian Bach, 1685 to 1750, was so substantial, consisting of some 1,100 works, and has had lasting and profound influence on music composition. While he was not famous during his lifetime and had disagreements with employers throughout his career, J.S. Bach's works and innovations in many ways defined music as people now know it. The tempered scale is among his inventions, and he initiated a keyboard technique that is considered standard today. Chronologically, J.S. Bach marks the end of the prolific and variegated Baroque era, which began about 1600 and ended the year of his death, 1750. A devout Christian, J.S. Bach believed that all music was to the glory of God and the recreation of the human spirit. As a spiritual person and true believer in eternal life, he left behind an impressive body of church music, including 300 cantatas, or musical sermons, as well as passions and oratorios. As a devoted family man who believed all his children were born musicians, and therefore, the Bachs could stage drawing room music at any time. J.S. Bach also wrote chamber music, including instrumental concertos, suites, and overtures. Among his most well-known and beloved works are the St. Matthew Passion, Jesu, Joy of Man's Desiring, Sheep May Safely Graze, and his Christmas Oratorio.
How did the jitterbug get started?
During the height of swing music's popularity in the late 1930s and early 1940s, there were at least 50 dance bands with national reputations and significant followings. Dance styles such as the jitterbug were based on big band music, the dominant form of American musical entertainment during those decades. The dance itself is a variation of the two-step. Couples swing and twirl in standardized patterns, which sometimes include acrobatics.
Why is Milton important to English literature?
Except for Shakespeare, the works of John Milton, 1608 to 1674, have been the subject of more commentary than those of any other English writer. Milton is considered one of only a few writers to take their place in the small circle of great epic writers. According to Norton Anthology of English Literature, in Milton's writings two tremendous intellectual and social movements come to a head. The movements referred to are the Renaissance and the Reformation. Scholars point to Milton's use of classical references and the rich tapestry of his works as being Renaissance in nature, while his earnest and individually minded Christianity are resonant of the Reformation. For example, in his masterpiece Paradise Lost, 1667, Milton, like poets Homer and Virgil before him, takes on humankind's entire experience, war, love, religion, hell, heaven, and the cosmos. But rather than having Adam triumph over evil through an act of heroism, he accepts the burden of worldly existence, and triumphs over his guilt by admitting it and repenting it. In addition to his famous epics, Milton wrote sonnets and other short poems, including on Shakespeare, El Allegro, Il Penseroso, and Lycidas. His writings also include political discourse, chief of which is the essay Areopagitica, 1644. Among the ideas that Milton championed were the limitation of the monarchy, dethroning of bishops, freedom of speech, and the institution of divorce. One commentator mused that the guarantees of freedom in the United States Constitution owe more to Milton's Areopagitica than to John Locke.
Why is Brahms's First Symphony sometimes called Beethoven's 10th?
In many ways, Johannes Brahms, 1833 to 1897, was the inheritor of Beethoven's genius, prompting some music historians to refer to Brahms's First Symphony as Beethoven's 10th. This is not to diminish the work of the great 19th-century composer, who left an enduring corpus of works. Brahms demonstrated that classicism continued to have artistic validity and was not incompatible with the Romanticism of the late 19th century.
How did the Charleston get started?
The Charleston, a lively ballroom dance, emerged in 1923 as one of the flashy elements of the period in American history that writer F. Scott Fitzgerald, 1896 to 1940, dubbed the Jazz Age. Other hallmarks of the Jazz Age, also called the Roaring Twenties, were speakeasies. Since the country was in the midst of prohibition, flappers, roadsters, raccoon coats, hedonism, and iconoclasm, the optimism of the Jazz Age came to a screeching halt on October 29, 1929. When the U.S. stock market crashed.
Who was the first to write a modern novel?
While there are differing opinions on the answer to this question, it is generally accepted that the credit for the novel as we know it belongs to Spanish writer Miguel de Cervantes, 1547–1616. Cervantes wrote Don Quixote, in two parts, 1605 and 1615. It was the first extended prose narrative in European literature in which characters and events are depicted in what came to be called the modern realistic tradition. Considered an epic masterpiece, Don Quixote had an undeniable influence on early novelists, including English novelist and playwright Henry Fielding, who wrote the realistic novel Tom Jones, 1749. Don Quixote is also said to have anticipated later fictional masterpieces, including French novelist Gustave Flaubert's Madame Bovary, 1857, Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Idiot, 1868–69. And American writer Mark Twain's The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, 1876, and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, 1884.
How old was Mozart when he composed his first work?
A child prodigy, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, 1756–1791, was composing at the age of 5. He had been playing the harpsichord since the age of 3. His father, Leopold, 1719–1787, was a composer and violinist who recognized his son's unusual music ability and encouraged and taught young Mozart. In 1762 Leopold took his son and daughter, Maria Anna, nicknamed Nannerl, 1751–1829, on tour to Paris. While there, young Wolfgang Mozart composed his first published violin sonatas and improvisations. However, the image of the effortless and artless child of nature is not altogether true. Contrary to the reports that the gifted composer never revised first and only drafts, he did work at his craft. In a letter to his father, he wrote, "It is a mistake to think that the practice of my art has become easy to me. No one has given so much care to the study of composition as I have. There is scarcely a famous master in music whose works I have not frequently and diligently studied." The fact is that he did make revisions to his works, though it is also true that he composed at a rapid pace. The result is an impressive body of works, unequaled in beauty and diversity. The complete output some 600 works in every form, symphonies, sonatas, operas, operettas, cantatas, arias, duets, and others, would be enough to fill almost 200 CDs. Among his most cherished works are The Marriage of Figaro, 1786. Don Giovanni, 1787, Così fan tutte, 1790, and The Magic Flute, 1791.
What is no drama?
It is the oldest form of traditional Japanese drama, dating to a.d. 1383. It is rooted in the principles of Zen Buddhism, a religion emphasizing meditation, discipline, and the transition of truth from master to disciple. History and legend are the subjects of no plays, which are traditionally performed on a bare wooden stage by masked male actors who performed the story using highly controlled movements. The drama is accompanied by a chorus, which chants lines from the play. The art form was pioneered by actor-dramatist Moto Kiyozumi, 1363–1443, when he was 20 years old. Zimi had begun acting at age 7 and went on to write more than half of the roughly 250 no dramas that are still performed today.
Who was Alexis de Tocqueville?
Aristocrat Alexis de Tocqueville, 1805–1859, was only 26 years old when he traveled to New York with his colleague and friend Gustave de Beaumont, 1802–1866, to study and observe American democracy. Though Tocqueville set out with the pretext of studying the American penal system on behalf of the French government, both he and Beaumont were magistrates at the time. He had the deliberate and personal goal of conducting an on-site investigation of the world's first and then only completely democratic society, the United States. Tocqueville and Beaumont traveled for 9 months through New England, eastern Canada, and numerous American cities, including New York, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Baltimore, Maryland, Washington, D.C., Cincinnati, Ohio, and New Orleans, Louisiana. The pair returned to France in 1832 and the following year published their study on the penitentiary system in the United States and its application in France. Once this official obligation was behind him, Tocqueville left his post as magistrate and moved into a modest Paris apartment. There he devoted 2 years to writing Democracy in America, 1835–1840. The work was soon proclaimed the classic treatment of its subject throughout the Western world and secured Tocqueville's fame as political observer, philosopher, and, later, sociologist. Tocqueville proclaimed that during his travels, nothing struck me more forcibly than the general equality of conditions. All classes meet continually and no haughtiness at all results from the differences in social position. Everyone shakes hands. But he also foresaw the possibility that the principles of economic equality could be undermined by the American passion for equality, which not only tends to elevate the humble to the rank of the great, but also impels the weak to attempt to lower the powerful to their own level. While he warned against the possible tyranny of the majority as a hazard of democracy, he also added that law, religion, and the press provide safeguards against democratic despotism.
What is a passion play?
A passion play is a dramatization of the scenes connected with the passion and crucifixion of Jesus Christ. The roots of the passion play can be traced to ancient times. Early Egyptians performed plays dedicated to the god Osiris, god of the underworld and judge of the dead. And the Greeks also acted out plays to honor their god Dionysus, the god of fertility, wine, and, later, drama. During the Middle Ages, 500–1350, liturgical, religious ceremonial, dramas were performed. Toward the end of the 10th century, the Western Church began to dramatize parts of the Latin Mass, especially for holidays such as Easter. These plays were performed in Latin by the clergy, inside the church building. Eventually the performances became more secular, with laymen acting out the parts on the steps of the church or even in marketplaces. The liturgical dramas developed into so-called miracle plays or mystery plays. As a symbol of gratitude or as a request for a favor, villagers would stage the life story of the Virgin Mary or of a patron saint. When the plague, also called the Black Death, ravaged Europe, the villagers at Oberammergau, Germany, in the Bavarian Alps, vowed to enact a passion play at regular intervals in the hope that by so doing they would be spared the Black Death. They first performed this folk drama in 1634 and have continued to stage it every 10 years. Attracting numerous tourists to the small town in southern Germany.
Why is the Globe Theatre famous?
The Globe is known because of William Shakespeare's, 1564–1616, involvement in it. In the 1590s an outbreak of the plague prompted authorities to close London theatres. At the time Shakespeare was a member of the Lord Chamberlain's Men, an acting company. With other members of the troupe, he helped finance the building of the Globe. On the banks of the Thames River, which opened in 1599 as a summer playhouse. Plays at the Globe, then outside of London proper, drew good crowds. And the Lord Chamberlain's Men also gave numerous command performances at court for King James. By the turn of the century, Shakespeare was considered London's most popular playwright. And by 1603 the acting group, whose summer home was the Globe Theatre, was known as the King's Men.
Who was Dame Margot Fontaine?
Fontaine, 1919–1991, has been called an international ambassador of dance. The British-trained ballerina achieved worldwide fame and recognition during more than 34 years with the Royal Ballet, expanding the company's female repertoire and becoming the model for the modern ballerina. In 1962, at the age of 43, Fontaine formed a dance partnership with Soviet defector Rudolf Nureyev. 1938–1993, challenging traditional assumptions about the ability of mature dancers to continue vigorous performance careers. In her later years, she continued to be active in the world of dance, helping set up dance scholarships, fostering international artistic relations, and encouraging the growth of dance institutions around the world.
How did the word Machiavellian get its meaning?
Machiavellian is defined as characterized by cunning, duplicity, or bad faith. It's based on the theory of Italian diplomat Niccolò Machiavelli, 1469 to 1527, who developed a code of political conduct that operates independent of ethics, thus disregarding moral authorities such as classical philosophy and Christian theology. In 1513, after having been exiled from Florence, Italy, by the powerful Medici family, Machiavelli abruptly turned his attention to writing The Prince, which puts forth a calm and uncompromising analysis of techniques and methods that the successful ruler must use in order to gain and keep power. Written in the form of advice to the ruler, Machiavelli advises the prince that only one consideration should govern his decisions: the effectiveness of a particular course of action, regardless of its ethical character. The book had little immediate impact in Italy, although it soon became legendary throughout Europe. And its major ideas, the power of politics, are familiar today even to people who have never read the book.
What was radio's immediate cultural impact?
During the 1930s, radio, pioneered in the late 1800s, was woven into the fabric of everyday American life. People across the country in cities, suburbs, and on farms tuned in for news and entertainment, including broadcasts of baseball games and other sporting events, as well as comedy and variety shows, dramas, and live music programs. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, 1882 to 1945, used the new medium to speak directly to the American public during the trying times of the Great Depression, broadcasting his fireside chats from the White House. Between the 1920s and the 1950s, gathering around the radio in the evenings was as common to Americans as watching television is today. Networks offered advertisers national audiences, and corporate America eagerly seized the opportunity to speak directly to people in their own homes. The advent of television in the 1950s and its growing popularity over the next 2 decades changed the role of radio in American life. Having lost their audience to TV, radio programmers seized rock music as a way to reach a wide, albeit a very young, audience. Many argue that the rise of the musical genre kept radio alive. In the decades since, radio programming has become increasingly music-oriented. Talk and news programming are also popular.
What was radio's immediate cultural impact?
During the 1930s, radio, pioneered in the late 1800s, was woven into the fabric of everyday American life. People across the country in cities, suburbs, and on farms tuned in for news and entertainment, including broadcasts of baseball games and other sporting events as well as comedy and variety shows, dramas, and live music programs. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, 1882 to 1945, used the new medium to speak directly to the American public during the trying times of the Great Depression, broadcasting his fireside chats from the White House. Between the 1920s and the 1950s, gathering around the radio in the evenings was as common to Americans as watching television is today. Networks offered advertisers national audiences, and corporate America eagerly seized the opportunity to speak directly to people in their own homes. The advent of television in the 1950s and its growing popularity over the next 2 decades changed the role of radio in American life. Having lost their audience to TV, radio programmers seized rock music as a way to reach a wide, albeit a very young, audience. Many argue that the rise of the musical genre kept radio alive. In the decades since, radio programming has become increasingly music-oriented. Talk and news programming are also popular.